Hello everyone. Thanks to everyone for watching this video. My name is Qida. I'm an architect and engineer. Today's video is titled Early Modern, and it is going to introduce the distinction between Renaissance and Baroque architectures. I am going to give you an overview of what I'm covering today's video. First at all, it is an introduction of early modern period, and then focus on the Renaissance and the Baroque architecture before wrapping up with conclusions. We are going to move on to early modern period, which spans the centuries between the Middle Ages and the Industrial Revolution. In this period, the architecture includes Renaissance and Baroque. The Renaissance is one of the periods to give itself a name. People in the Renaissance were feeling quite pleased with their own engagement with history and their ability to supersede the efforts of the people who came before them. They came up with this great name for themselves: those who had been reborn, the Renaissance. People during the Baroque period considered themselves to be practitioners of the same agenda that the Renaissance was engaging. They were using classical architecture, using classical typology, using the orders. They were playing with symmetry and balance, doing it in a much more concatenated manner. The world was changing quite rapidly at that time. Changing is not simply from an aesthetic point of view, but all aspects of culture were changing. This is an image of René Descartes, the famous French mathematician. We know that Cartesian coordinates, based on Euclidean geometry, the only things we could define were the Platonic solids. Suddenly, Descartes comes up with a system that authorizes any point in space, and gives mathematical provenance to any point in space. It provides a system to organize everything, instead of a nomenclature for discrete objects, and there you see a real shift between a Baroque way of thinking and a Renaissance way of thinking. Now we see the two-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system, and that is arrow. Where is that arrow going? Infinity, which is a new concept, right? The idea that something could be whooshing off to infinity. The idea that not all things are bounded, but that an axis could extend infinitely. It's another kind of amazing discovery in the early modern period. Let's go back to this parsing of terms between Renaissance and Baroque. People like Heinrich Wölfflin helped Baroque reclaim legitimacy by establishing ground rules that it plays by that are slightly different than the ground rules that were aimed for during the Renaissance. Wölfflin finds 5 oppositional pairs of qualities that will allow you to understand the difference between Renaissance and Baroque. He's thinking about Renaissance to Baroque, not simply as new stuff proliferating, but that one thing arises dialectically in opposition to the other. You can begin to understand its relationship, but its relationship is not simply bad version of Renaissance, but something aiming at quite different things. Wölfflin says a Renaissance quality is linear, and a Baroque quality is painterly. Linear has to do with line, that the primary way that the image is communicated. It's through line, through delineation, as opposed to painterly. Painterly means fields of color, the tactility of paint, the gesture of the paintbrush, all work to communicate that image. And you might say, okay, that's true about painting, but how does that pertain to architecture? I will say it has to do with the surface of the wall. If you think about a Renaissance wall, it would be flat, maybe articulated in little polychromatic panels, but quite flat. When you begin to think about a Michelangelo wall, like the Laurentian Library, there are different layers to it. When you get to a Baroque wall, there will be incredible plasticity of the wall. Niches come out, columns popping out, so that you get ambiguity about exactly where the surface is, and the surface presents itself as a play of light and shade, rather than simply a plane that you can name. The next thing that Wölfflin tells us we need to pay attention to is how space is constructed, and Wölfflin begins by talking about painting, but then he expands into a discussion of architecture. He talks about planar recession versus diagonal recession, Planar recession is basically one-point perspective where things march back in a series of planes. Diagonal recession might be 2 or even 3-point perspective where there are multiple vanishing points. One-point perspective. This planar recession insists upon a single central focus in the composition, whereas diagonal recession, multiple vanishing points begins to open up the door for multiple centers of activity, and a kind of diffuse world of things happening all over the surface of the picture. Another thing he talks about is closed form versus open form, and he expands that to speak about tectonic and atectonic in architecture, closed and open. We can understand closed, open. We spread our arms out and so forth. And in architecture, tectonic form might mean the system is closed, so that you can understand the entire constructional system. Think of the temple, you see the pediment, the columns, and you understand exactly what's going on. When you get a tectonic form or an open form, there might be some ambiguity exactly about where does the figure even end. How does it engage the city? The implication of how the figure is part of the city is not clear as it is with these ideal centralized churches. It becomes seen graphically engaged and its constructional system becomes ambiguous. 2 more points and then we will look at some examples. Unity and multiplicity. A lot of this has to do with what the one-point perspective gives you versus the multiple vanishing point perspective. Unity gives you a single subject, a single center. Multiplicity gives you lots of stuff happening all over the place. And lots of stuff might not simply be the image, but it also might be different materials that get put into play or different color palettes. For example, when we look at architecture, we will see that there are not simply these superpositions of different things on the wall, like columns, niches, engaged columns, pilasters. But there's also an engagement of sculpture and kind of theoretical space planning, and strange light and polychromatic material and painting. So that all of these different art forms collaborate to give you your experience. Then from absolute clarity to relative clarity, and he's talking here especially about painting. But it also has to do with architecture. This ambiguous figure-ground relationship you begin to get. When architecture is not conceived of as an object, but as a scene graphic piece of a city where all of this stuff unfolds spatially to the viewer. So I think these are great images as a kind of comparison. It illustrates our argument quite well, that in terms of linear, even if it were a painting, it could have this kind of dominant representation of the form through line. Planar recession. We see things organized on the orthogonality of the plane. Closed form. It depends on where he's standing. Everything is contained within the circle. It's one thing and it's clear as clear can be. When you look at the painting in Rubens, the composition of the painting is complicated. It's not planar recession, and it is diagonal. In fact, the whole thing is a kind of spiral. It's an intricate tangle of figures. The guy is in the center, but all the other people are participating in this, so you have multiple foci. You don't have your absolute clarity. If this were a better image, you would see the way Rubens handles paint. From a distance, it looks like a nice room, but if you get really close to it, it is just this much. Rubens is looking at nature. He is not hyper-idealizing things. There is an interest not just in perfection, but in how things are in the world. In terms of relative obscurity, you might say the light in the Leonardo clearly shows us everything we need to know about figure. And in the Rubens, there is this chiaroscuro, which is an art history term, meaning clear dark. And that simply means this strong play of light and dark. So figures begin to be swallowed up into the background instead of being revealed and clearly illuminated. Let's see how they play out in architectural terms. We have San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane by Francesco Bromini, We also have the Pazzi Chapel by Filippo Brunelleschi. They couldn't be more different, but just in terms of what is a wall. In the Pazzi Chapel, we can see these nice modules. These pilasters giving us these clear figures, half a circle, square. We come over the Borromini, and it is really ambiguous. The wall itself is unstable, and it is undulating. It's not even a flat surface. And out of this undulating wall, little building is popping out. You know what is the wall? What's the wall all about? You see the stack orders, but inside the stack orders we see a minor order, and we see niched carved. The wall of the Borromini church presents itself as these superpositions of multiple layers. You might compare it almost to the structure of the Baroque music, like a fugue where you have counterpoint going on. You get various themes and variations on the themes being simultaneously played over one another to create a kind of complex and very rich patterns. Even in terms of planar recession versus diagonal recession, the Pazzi Chapel emphasizes the orthogonal, and the orthogonal allows itself to be understood in terms of a series of planes. This thing has an orthogonal line on it. It is this kind of a weird overlays across. How does it sit in the city? It is the undulating facade, and then it seems to peel away from that corner and unwrap. Like the vantage point that a painter can stipulate in a composition can also apply to architecture. It really seems to be fairly effective in these two examples. Closed form, perfect little thing, done. Open form, where does it end? How does this thing engage the city? Multiplicity, lots of stuff going on. From conclusions, what we learned? Renaissance architecture began early in the 1400s, while Baroque came later in the 1600s. Renaissance architecture works didn't completely depict human emotion, while Baroque architecture focused more on showing them. Okay, thanks to everyone for watching my video today, and I do hope you found the video informative, and that you learned something from it. If you do have any questions, then you can write comments and messages. I am happy to answer any questions. Thanks for your watching.